Hi everyone, thanks a lot for joining the FOCIL Breakout number 10. And I'm excited because today we have two good presentations that were prompted in the Discord, I think by Mark. And we end up having like exactly the two presenters that are like the most experts are for presenting these things, so it's pretty cool. But just right before we dive in, I wanted to make a small announcement that there is going to be a lot of things happening in Berlin in June, including a session that's like dedicated to FOSSOL. For now, it's very tentative, and it can change a lot, but it's scheduled on Wednesday, the 11th in the afternoon. So if any of you guys that have been attending the calls are around, if you're a core dev or researcher, just that is like really working on FOSSOL, just you're always welcome to join. And if you want to join, just like send me a message or something and we'll make it happen. But yeah, more generally, I think a lot of things are going to happen around like Ethereum related things in Berlin in June. So yeah, if you're around, let me and everyone that's interested know. And yeah, I think the FOSSOL session will basically be focused on like present everything that's been done on the implementation and research side around FOSSOL. And maybe since we are like all together in person, just try to get some consensus about like the future directions where we can take FOSSOL, and yeah, both in the research and in the implementation side. I think at some point we need to sort of like be explicit or like make an actual push about like what fork we would want FOSSOL to land on. We haven't really done that yet, and I think it shouldn't always be top of mind, but it maybe, yeah, I've been thinking some maybe more intentionality would be nice at some point when we feel like FOSSOL is like close to the end and we have done a bit more tests. I think at some point it makes sense to also like say it that we've been doing that. So because I feel like some people, I don't know, I was just asked recently by someone that's like still like, in that core dev and everything, like how how is FOSSOL doing on the research side of things? I was like, oh, yeah, it's been done on the research side basically for like a long time now, and we have like DevNets and interop working, so it's much further than what people, well, at least some people think. So yeah, I think we should maybe talk about this a bit more. And then on the research side, you have like, ZK FOSSOL, stateless FOSSOL, and then everything that's going to be talked about today, which is also extremely interesting, is like how FOSSOL interacts with other upgrades or forks, or yeah, I mean not forks, but upgrades or proposals or EIPs. And so we have Tony and Potus. Tony will talk about FOSSOL and delayed execution. And yeah, then Potus, I don't think he's there yet. He told me he was going to be a bit late maybe, but once he joins, he's going to talk about FOSSOL and EPBS. And it's kind of interesting because I feel like delayed execution and EPBS are like somewhat in competition. So we can also like talk about like the advantages and pros and cons for both approaches. And I think that's also like an interesting angle to like look at both presentations. So yeah, if you want to go, Tony, I think I saw you. We'll start with you if that's okay.
Yes, sounds good. 1 second. Okay, I created some slides here. Perfect. Yeah. delayed execution and FOCIL. Right, so initially it started a little more complex because delayed execution and FOCIL initially, if you remember the initial design, they were not really compatible, and we kind of worked a lot with Thomas in order to kind of get to a solution on that. And today I kind of think we can present a solution that works, that makes FOCIL very well compatible with delayed execution. And this is basically what I'm going to talk about in the following presentation. Just as a quick recap, so what is delayed execution? Let's look at block validation today. At T0, the block proposer proposes the block, that the station deadline is at 4 seconds into the slot, and then at some point the next proposer needs to run fork choice in order to determine which head block to build on top of. And I've now just split up the first part until the attestation deadline between propagation and execution. And with execution, I mean both. So beacon block checks plus the EL payload checks. And what delayed execution is now trying to achieve is the following. We just extend the execution time. So instead of having to finish execution at the attestation deadline, you can just execute during the whole slot. This gives you way more time, and hopefully we can scale the gas limit or shorten the slot time, or something similar. Right, so this is the goal what delayed execution is trying to achieve, and it works in the following. Today, we chain blocks together using the parent hashes, and the execution outputs commit to their own block. So we have post execution outputs that commit to the execution of the same block. And instead of doing that, we get a picture like the following, where instead of committing to the execution outputs of the same block, we just commit to the execution outputs of the parent block. And this is kind of nice for CKVMs because it gives them more time for real-time proving. And at the same time, it gives us at the execution layer more scale. So just as a quick recap, the initial design that some of you might still be familiar with was using the Coinbase for the inclusion cost. And the inclusion cost was everything that has to do with data. So call data, blobs, and the access lists. And the Coinbase address had to pay for the inclusion cost before we even start execution. This means we check the block statically. Then we check, has the Coinbase paid for the inclusion cost? And if so, attesters can attest to the block and can basically already delay the execution because they at that point have the certainty that the block they just attested to will become canonical or will be valid because we did all the checks up front that could make the block invalid. If a transaction turns out to be invalid during execution, for example, because its balance was drained or the block is already full, we consumed all the gas available, then the transaction can simply be skipped. And this is not a problem because someone already paid for that transaction. So it lands on chain, it becomes canonical, but someone had paid for that transaction, so we don't have to worry. And yeah, as already said, at the station time, the validators know that the block is valid, so they can attest to that block. And it's not like they would attest to a block that suddenly, after the attestation, turns invalid. And this had some problems with FOCIL because, of course, as you can see here at T4, we want to know, is the block valid or is it invalid? And FOCIL comes with this post-execution validity condition when a transaction is not in the execution payload, but it's on an IL, then you have to check, could it have been included into the block? So you have to try to append that transaction to the end of the block. And this moves kind of the validity check of the execution payload to the end of the block because we have to check if a transaction could have been included. We have to do that at the end. And this makes then no sense because then we would have to move the attestation deadline to the same point, and then the whole delayed execution would not work. So a nicer way how we can do so is by charging the senders of transaction upfront. So we take the maximum that the transaction specifies, the full gas limit times the gas price, and we charge that amount upfront before we start executing any transaction. This would then look like the following. Today, on the left-hand side, we have the block validation, which includes of static validation and transaction execution. And we would take the charging the senders out of the transaction execution bucket and do it separately before starting executing any transaction, which means that if you have the funds to send a certain transactions at the beginning of the block, you will already reserve that gas, and then you will always be able to send the transaction, which means transactions cannot be invalidated anymore because of balance drains and the sender doesn't not having the money anymore. Right. And what we need to do for FOCIL, how to make this FOCIL compatible, because this doesn't really solve the problem of not knowing how much gas the block effectively consumes, because now we only know the transactions by the full gas limit they specify. So what we need to do here is we have to introduce a new header field where the builder has to specify how much gas the builder is using. And by having that information, what we can do is we can check, could that transaction have been included into the block without actually executing the whole block. And this would then look like the following. The builder declares the gas used in the header, and then the FOCIL validators, they can check the validity of the inclusion list by having the following: the pre-state, the set of transactions, and the IL. So this is nothing new, but then they also have a new field in the header which says gas used. And based on that, they can determine if a transaction could have fit into the block, but it wasn't included, because this would then again turn the block into an invalid block. And finally, if the gas used is then specified wrong by the builder, which would be some very strange 3DA attack, then the whole transaction payload would revert. So builders have a strong incentive to not do so, because they would lose all the prior fees and yeah, basically everything in the block if every transaction reverts. Yeah, this is all I have. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Okay, yeah, that was very clear, at least to me. Yeah, there was a small question by Terence. He said, you want to run the fork choice also before you attest as well, because you need to attest to the head.
Yeah, that's of course true. I meant fork choice of the next proposer, basically.
Yeah, okay, makes sense.
Yeah. This
And
is,
then
yeah, good.
if you do a weird 3DA attack on the builder side, so you lose all the priority fees and for the block. Do you lose any CL reward or no?
No, you would still get them. So
Yeah.
the block would still be valid and you could still attest to the block. It's basically an empty payload. And things we can do is we could just skip the transactions of the payload, but still have deposits or withdrawal or other requests being processed.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then would penalties, like additional penalties, help like against this attack, or is that, do you think just like not getting the execution rewards is enough for it not to happen?
Yeah, I think it's enough. Of course, there is, I mean, if we want to talk about this worst case scenario, then this would be a block where the builder specifies a wrong gas used. Because if you specify a wrong gas used, then the block, the transaction payload will just revert, which means all the transactions in that block will have paid nothing, plus the builder would have not received anything. Those transactions would, of course, stay canonical, right? Because you cannot just drop them for reasons like you would need to check the validity of this state reversion. So we would have to keep those transactions. We would also have to keep them for sync. But the thing is that it's just not really worth it to do so, right? Because you would just you could just let's assume there is some market that pushes you to do so, then this market would give you definitely less than what you would get in prior fees. Otherwise, the market we would have some market inefficiencies.
Yeah, that makes sense. Nice. Cool. And then Lukash said the gas used in the block header means that the builder has to execute the block, which can be viewed as suboptimal in a way.
Yes, so the builder has to execute everything. The builder has to know exactly how much gas the block is going to use. And based on this knowledge, so validators in FOCIL, they just trust that value. They see, okay, the block consumed 35 million gas and 36 is available. And there is a transaction in the inclusion list that consumes 2 million, so it doesn't fit. Then the FOCIL committee, the FOCIL validators or the validators in general can just decide, okay, they see, okay, this transaction is too large and I will just trust the specified gas used and not enforce the inclusion list, which means I will attest to the block and not vote for the head block in order to reorg it because of the invalid inclusion list. And then after execution, you verify, was the specified gas used actually right? And if it was right, the block stays as it is. And if it wasn't, it becomes a no-op. The state will just revert.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. And then, so yeah, I think so. I read your post just before the session, so now I think like with the presentation, I understood it quite well. But the post was quite like about like listing all the options, and then you finished with the one that was both compatible with FOSL and without like sort of like tons of additional fork choice complexity or like attestations that will vote for the right block, but like not actually get the rewards and stuff like this. Like, do you feel like in your mind at least like is this the solution that sounds like it makes the most sense, or like have you sort of settled on one that's best?
Yeah, this is a good question. Of course, still to be decided, but to very quickly speedrun the whole design space, we started with Coinbase sponsoring, where the problem was directly like we don't want to introduce new signatures on the EL. Probably this is a lot of work, and users might need two keys, a withdrawal key and a signing key on the EL, because of course we don't want to have keys that handle funds being controlled by a hotkey. So this would create already a very complicated situation that requires some, yeah, that would change the UX for validators quite significantly if you suddenly need to control a balance on the EL2. Then, of course, we could say, okay, then we treat it as a penalty. And instead of staking on the EL, you get a penalty for skipped transactions on the CL. But then the problem is for MEF Boost users, you would sign a payload where you don't know what the payload is actually doing. And the payload could actually skip many transactions. And then you, as the Coinbase, you would pay you as the proposer, you would pay for that. So suddenly, when you are using MEF Boost, the worst case, the worst thing that could happen would not be getting nothing, but actually even losing funds. And yeah, so the pre-charging some entity approaches were kind of difficult for the just outlined reasons. And then what we can do is pre-charging the senders, because what you avoid by pre-charging the sender is that one transaction sender drains the balance of another sender, and they invalidate their transactions within the block. Of course, one important point, which is a big downside with this approach, is that funding an account and sending from that account within one block becomes impossible. And this is also something that, yeah, I don't really like a lot. So maybe that's also not yet the final decision design.
Okay, wait, can you just repeat? I lost you on the
So
funding and
if
spending.
you if you fund an account and you want to send from that account in the same block, this is of course possible today. But
Yeah.
with the pre-charging all the senders and then starting execution, it wouldn't be possible anymore because at the time where we would pre-charge you, you would have a zero balance, right?
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
Yeah,
this is
so
of
you
course a use case
empty. Yeah, yeah.
that is used
There
by
are
users,
refunds after. Yeah, yeah. Okay, there are like refunds afterwards, but like since you actually charge like the full sort of
right?
like gas limit. Okay,
Right.
yeah, that makes sense.
You could solve that by allowing the Coinbase to sponsor the base fee and stuff, but this just complicates the whole thing and is probably better to treat separately. So this is definitely a thing that we still need to solve.
Okay, one very vague comment before I let Mark speak, but I mean, yeah, I haven't looked into it. I always bring it up, but like I need to actually look at it way more. What about like this sort of like idea of a reserve balance or something that will be used specifically from users to handle like um, this problem? Would that help in some way, like sort of have like two balances?
Yeah, I think that wouldn't really help in this regard because here it's really about an account that has no ETH but would be able to do a transaction if he receives ETH beforehand, right? So there's no reserve balance if
Yeah.
someone has no
Okay.
ETH. Yeah, but it's getting
Yeah.
very close to this reserve balance idea already because what you do is you reserve the maximum possible fees for each sender before starting executing.
Yeah. 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 For sure. Okay. Cool. That makes sense. Yeah. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify exactly how the inclusion list checks will look with this change. I think you had the slide about like all the different kind of variables you have, like the pre-execution state and all that kind of stuff. Um, but so the checks now, you're just looking at the gas used and the gas limit of the inclusion list transaction and just seeing if you have space. So you don't need to execute anything.
Right, yeah. So you can see the slides now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so the four things are the pre-state. So you could basically check is the transaction valid against the pre-state? So if you get a transaction on an inclusion list that has two low nonce, then you can directly filter it out and not enforce it. Then you have the set of transactions that you receive in the block, and you have the inclusion list that you saw being propagated through a network. And then what you can do is you get the block, you see the block has, for example, the sum of transactions that the sum of the gas that the transactions claim to use is way above the gas limit, but the actual gas use can of course be lower. So what you would need to do is you look into the header, into the gas used field in the header, where the builder specified and commits to how much gas this block is going to use. And then if the builder says the block is full, then you don't have to enforce the inclusion list because FOCIL allows you to keep to don't enforce the inclusion list if the block is already full.
Right. Thank you.
Great. Maybe last one. I think Lukasz, you wrote in the chat. Maybe can you speak or do you want me to read it out loud?
Not sure. So in general, the delayed execution could allow builders to behave a bit more sequencer-like. So not to execute all blocks at all, or maybe execute only some part of the block. Because, for example, MEV can happen in the beginning of the block, and they want to maybe validate that and then just add later transactions based on from like the public mempool without executing them. And this would require for them to execute the whole block always, which might be a valid trade-off. So I'm not against it. Just a small trade-off that builders can't, because in general, delayed execution allows builders to behave more sequencer-like, but with this, they can't.
Yeah, this is interesting. I think if I got you right, I agree with that. I'm just thinking what would be the problem here, right? Because what the builder would of course do, the builder would check the nonce and the balance, because then the builder can ensure that the whole payload will not revert. But as soon as the builder check the nonce and the balance, he can throw that transaction basically into the block. If it's at the last index in the block, then nothing can really happen. That's what you meant, right? So the builder could just
Yeah,
skip the
even multiple
execution.
transactions, right, with delayed execution. Because if the transaction, fails or whatever, the builder doesn't care too much, especially for like low-paying transactions, right?
But if the nonce and the balance is wrong, then the block is still invalid. So that's what you would still check
Okay.
pre-attestation.
Pre-attestation. Okay, but you're
So
checking the nonce and the balance compared to pre-state.
to the pre-state, right?
Yeah.
So not like in between state of the block. Yeah, but that can be checked way before building the block, right? As soon as the transaction is seen.
Right. So currently in the specs, it's it's just a for loop over all transactions, and the nonce every time when we see a sender, the nonce of that sender is increased by one. First
Mhm.
checked if it's correct, and then increased by
Uh,
one, and the balance
Are
is
you
just
talking are you talking about validating FOCIL or general?
general with delayed
General.
execution.
Okay, okay, okay,
Yeah.
okay. Mm-hmm.
So
So,
it's just the nonces are
mhm,
checked before we do any execution of transactions, and the same with the balance. So the nonces and the balance would still invalidate a block. Testers would
mhm.
not attest to a block where a transaction with an invalid nonce or uh, a non-funded account is in there. But the only thing that can really revert the block is specifying the wrong gas. So it should be a very, very rare occasion. And then, of course, some data got on chain for basically free. So if you have a transaction and the builder puts it on chain but specifies a wrong gas limit, then your transaction lands on chain. It won't execute. The call data will be there and you will not pay for it.
Okay, but are we talking about this gas use in the header? Sorry, I'm confused.
And the gas used in the header is really just used for FOCIL. We could remove
Mhm.
it if we don't do FOCIL at the same
Okay.
time.
Okay, right. Okay. Yeah, so I'm talking just basically if you push gas use in the header, then the builder has to execute the block. If you don't have gas use in the header, the builder could build a block or part of the block without executing those transactions.
This is interesting. This is actually an interesting point, especially maybe thinking of distributed block building or something. Yeah,
So
this is
that's a
this is an interesting
trade-off.
point.
That's I wanted to just.
Mhm.
I'm not saying which one we should pick, which one is better. What was. I'm just pointing out a trade-off that is being done
Yeah,
here.
yeah, it's a good point. I think if Fossil wouldn't ship at the same time, then we can just remove the gas used field in the header, and then we just need it for Fossil in order to kind of
Oof.
move this post-execution check to the pre-execution.
Okay, but like if you ship delayed execution without gas used, and some people start using it as a sequencer like or part sequencer like, right? So they build part of the block, but because this, the timing is they want to wait till the end for the MEV transactions, then they can easily fill up the rest of the block with not executing them, right? And then if you want to reintroduce gas use, then you can have friction, right? So
Right, but those transactions, they would still be good transactions, right? Because if they fill them without executing and the block will still not revert or be invalid.
they should have correct nonces, etc., right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because in this case, you could even sell it as a feature that builders can just stream their transactions into the block without executing them.
Yes, to some extent, yes.
Yeah, I agree with Lucas. So it would be like sort of like a friction point if builders like got used to do it and then like we'll have to go back for FOCIL. But in general, like I don't know. My general take is like that we should be okay with imposing some constraints to builders, and that's basically what FOCIL is about. So if it also means like having to execute to put that gas used in the header, like yeah, maybe it's a tiny bit of a loss of an efficiency for builders, but like it's probably worth it considering like other approaches are like probably worse for them if you consider censorship resistance.
But if I can add something, my point is, as from the point I'm starting giving feedback about delayed execution, it's more complicated than it seems. It actually has some.
Delayed execution itself, you mean?
Yeah. That it opens up different doors and it's more complicated than I think initially estimated. I just said like a joke.
Okay. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, I feel like to me at least it's quite. What I like about it is like the concept is very straightforward. Like you do every static check you can do, but but you don't do execution and like you leave that for later, and so you gain there. So at least like the idea to me is like quite appealing because like I don't know, it just like it's very easy for me to make a mental model of it. And then some of the complexity comes related, I mean, with FOSL, I guess. I also feel like it's yeah, like imposing constraints on builders, for example, like that has come from FOSL, and I think that's fine. But then yeah, I was gonna just ask the question like that always troubles me, and I want to know if you guys thought of it for delayed execution, which is like, is it gonna be something that's fine and completely compatible with full and native account abstraction? Did you guys think about this, or like are there like no conflicts there?
Yeah, it should be. Because, for example,
Okay.
for native account abstraction, I mean, most of the times when there are problems with native account abstraction, then it's because of addresses draining each other's balances, right? And yeah, that's basically solved with this reserved gas.
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't talking about 7702. I was talking about like the more general native, like 7701 or something, when you can like do arbitrary things. But I guess, yeah, it always comes down to like emptying or like emptying an addresses balance, I guess, at the end of the day. Okay, that's cool. That makes sense. I see POTUS is not here yet, so maybe we do an interlude of implementation things, and then we get to POTUS presentations on EPBS and FOSO if that works. But maybe yeah. First, like, does anyone have updates? Did anyone make progress? Yeah, anyone is welcome to speak about this.
I don't have any update on like a client implementation side. As you all may recall, I was working on a Wrath implementation, but lately I've been working on the execution specs, and then once that is done, I'll work on adding some execution spec tests. More specifically, it looks like there's a way to add tests for the engine API new payload So that would be the plan, and should have something by the next call, if not sooner. So definitely be sharing that in the Discord. Should have a PR up and execution specs at least in the next day or two, and then yeah, the execution spec test will follow. But yeah, that's mainly it for me.
Awesome, thanks. And just to make sure, are you working with the Steel team on this, or have you worked on this by yourself for now?
For now, it's just been myself, but yeah, I think I will be. Yeah, have some questions for the Steel team, with respect to
Okay,
at least
nice.
the spec test.
All right. Yeah, we have we have a yeah. I will add you to a group. Anyone else is welcome to join, by the way. But there is a FOCIL and Steel group already, so that will be easy. Yeah, that's great. Thanks a lot. No update from Prism, Lodestar.
Tony, your screen is still on the Zoom, just FYI.
Yeah. Yeah, Tony, if you want to like, just maybe stop sharing your screen. No big update from Nethermind. And Mercy, you posted a screenshot. Do you have anything to share?
No, exactly. This is I just posted my update for the two that I was working on. Currently we just have I'm able to subscribe to the Beacon API event for inclusion list, and then login received inclusion list data per slot, and also showing transaction counts in the logs. I'm hoping to work more on fetching the block data for each slot and then performing comparison between transaction proposed in the IL event and then where it was actually included in the block. That's just what I have for now.
Okay, nice. Great. Thanks for sharing. Cool. No updates on Teku. No updates on Nethermind. Anything from the Lighthouse team? I remember they were like very, very close to interrupt, but I'm not sure right now. No, doesn't seem so. Okay. And is anyone going to be in Berlin in June? I mean, I know Tony, Jacob are probably going to be there. Is Jihun and Anders too? Nixo probably. Is Jihun joining? Anyone else wants to? Justin, nice. Okay. Enrico, okay. Like a lot of people. Great. Okay, so okay, that's awesome. Nice. So yeah, make sure you check the FOCIL session out, because I think it will be nice to have like at least a quick yeah, presentation on where we are at in terms of implementations and where or what we've done so far. It will be like a good way to showcase it and then talk about it a bit more. Cool. Okay. I still don't see voters, so does anyone have anything else to share? Otherwise, we can also like close it and leave the presentation for the next session. Okay. Then looks like we will have the EPBS and FOCIL presentation on the next session. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining, and see you around.
Bye.
Bye.